COVID surges through China, risking another global outbreak. A new study finds that over 1 million people in China could die. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Merry Christmas, everyone. People are dying in China, and the Communist Party is trying to cover it up. For 3 years, the Chinese Communist Party implemented one of the most brutal COVID lockdowns in the world. The Communist Party knew it couldn't keep that up forever. Not because of the massive human suffering it caused, no. It was costing the government too much money. When it came to China ending its zero COVID policy, it was a matter of when, not if. Kind of like Hollywood doing yet another remake of Batman. You know what's going to happen. At this point, we've seen Bruce Wayne's parents get shot more times than I've flossed, and I have excellent oral hygiene. Now you'd think that in preparation for the end of zero COVID, the government would make sure there was a good stockpile of medicine, hospitals had plenty of staff and bed, things like that. But nope, there's a massive shortage of medicine. As COVID rips through parts of China, millions of Chinese are struggling to find treatment, from the most basic cold remedies to take at home to more powerful antivirals for patients in hospitals. Medicine in China is harder to find than Waldo wearing all black at midnight in a forest during a lunar eclipse. Great interpretation, Seamus. Part of the problem is the government was already artificially keeping the stock of these medicines low because of zero COVID restrictions. They limited how much people could buy. The policy had required buyers to register their names, a rule aimed at preventing residents from using over-the-counter drugs to reduce fevers and avoid detection by the country's pervasive health tracking system. Yeah, because it'd be a shame if during the Communist Party's quest to get rid of COVID, people reduced their symptoms and limited the spread of COVID. Brilliant. Well, that's blowing up in their faces. The situation in hospitals is no better. They aren't equipped for the new COVID surge. China has only 4.5 intensive care unit beds for every 100,000 people. Again, that was something the Chinese Communist Party could have planned for over the past 3 years. Made sure hospitals had more ICU beds, or build more hospitals. Yeah, but who has time for frivolous things like hospitals when you're busy spreading shady police forces to other countries? All you people complaining, well, I'm dying, why aren't there any hospital beds? It's because the Communist Party had their priorities straight. But building more hospitals is a little harder to do than just building massive quarantine centers. Less showy, too. Actual hospitals require carefully planned layouts, expensive equipment, reliable plumbing and wiring, etc. These quarantine camps don't. China is totally unprepared for a COVID surge, a surge that even Al Pacino's character in Scent of a Woman could have seen coming a mile away. And the consequences are dire. Now, a new study says more than 1 million people in China could die. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. The COVID surge in China is really bad. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, is China really backing off zero COVID? I think the party is going to try to blame protesters. They demanded an end to zero COVID, the party gave them what they wanted, and now look at what happened. Of course, the protesters aren't actually to blame because China's COVID surge began before the protests.
COVID is spreading like wildfire in China, 9 days after the government abruptly stopped mass testing and forcible quarantine. Measures the WHO said had stopped working anyway.
The explosion of cases in China is not due to the lifting of COVID restrictions. The explosion of cases in China had started long before any easing of the zero COVID policy.
This is like blaming Gen Z for the war in Iraq, the one started by George H.W. Bush. The Communist Party had 3 years to stockpile medicine, build up hospitals, and get people vaccinated, but it squandered that time. And instead used it on propaganda to show how much better China was than the West at handling COVID. But now, some experts estimate that some 60% of China's 1.4 billion people, about 10% of the global population, could be infected with COVID-19 in the coming months. A new study by the University of Hong Kong says that could mean more than 1 million deaths. Look, I get procrastinating until the last minute on a project, but maybe do that for a term paper and not for a deadly pandemic. China's coming COVID deaths won't necessarily be just from COVID itself, though. When hospitals are overrun, people will die from other things too. And a large portion of the population is unvaccinated, and there is little hybrid immunity from the virus itself. There are 8 million unvaccinated Chinese people over the age of 80, and more than 60 million people have diabetes. In other words, there's low vaccination and low natural immunity from COVID. Plus, people have other comorbidities like diabetes that will make the COVID death toll much worse. So there's a lot of diabetic elderly people who don't trust the government. It's official, China is the Florida of the East. Except the stories coming out of China are somehow even crazier and scarier. But don't worry, when faced with such a looming catastrophe, the Chinese Communist Party knows just what to do. Change the definition of a COVID death. Basically, if there's some kind of comorbidity authorities can use to explain away the death, they will. This is completely different from the way every other country has been counting COVID deaths. Even if an otherwise perfectly healthy young person died of COVID, China would just say, he had a hangnail. Yep, that's what did him in. But it's no surprise, as we've seen throughout the entire pandemic, the Chinese Communist Party has used false and misleading data. So far, over the past 2 weeks in Beijing, a city more than twice the size of New York, China has reported just 2 COVID deaths. Meanwhile, there are already signs the real death toll is much higher. An employee at a funeral home on the outskirts of Beijing told CNN they were swamped by the long queues for cremation, and customers would need to wait until at least the next day to cremate their loved ones. On Baidu, China's main search engine, searches for funeral homes have hit a record high. The point is, the number of deaths officially reported by the government are not matching up with how many bodies there are in funeral parlors. One expert is warning it could be thermonuclear bad. Wow, I had no idea there was such a dangerous spread of hangnails. And the problems won't be limited to just China. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. China is suffering from a massive COVID outbreak, and it could have a global impact. According to the chief epidemiologist at China's CDC, this is just one wave of COVID. The current wave would run until mid-January. The second wave is expected to last from late January to mid-February next year, triggered by the mass travel ahead of the Lunar New Year holiday, which falls on January 21st. Now, if you remember, the original pandemic really got rolling during the 2020 Lunar New Year, because instead of stopping the pandemic when only a few people were infected, Communist Party officials covered it up. And a big part of that was to avoid interrupting Lunar New Year festivities. So in 2023, as COVID spreads through China, mass travel could spread another wave around the world. Is history repeating itself? Just like Hollywood repeatedly telling Batman's origin story over and over and over again? Earlier this week, the U.S. State Department warned this is a concern for the world. State Department spokesman Ned Price said that any time the virus was spreading, it had the potential to mutate and could pose a threat to people everywhere. And if that happens, we could run into the same problem we had at the start of the pandemic. We run out of toilet paper. Quick, start stockpiling now, everyone. Oh, and also, China dominates the medical supply chain. That still hasn't changed. Chinese state-run media have already been talking about a recent push by Chinese drug makers under the direction of the central government to increase medical supplies, but not hospital beds. Seriously, quit whining about how you're dying and get your priorities straight. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 how China hoarded medical supplies and essentially nationalized production of face masks, even from American companies. In other words, American companies like 3M couldn't export supplies from their factories in China to the U.S. So if this COVID spike in China becomes another global surge, we might be right back where we were in 2020. Unless, of course, the world learned its lesson since the start of the pandemic, but somehow I don't think it has. When it comes to finding a lesson to learn about trusting China, the world has an easier time finding Waldo wearing all black at midnight in a forest during a lunar eclipse. Now it's time for me to answer a question from a fan who supports China Uncensored on the crowdfunding website Patreon, or our exclusive social media community on Locals. Today's question comes from The Crazy Years on Locals. The CCP is murdering tens of thousands of Americans every year with fentanyl, harmfully manipulating the minds of our kids via the TikTok algorithm, harassing our military in the South China Sea, and has hundreds of nuclear-armed ICBMs targeted at America. Why have we not declared communist China to be an enemy nation? Is it diplomatic cowardice, greedy, corrupt politics, or what? That really is an excellent question. The Chinese Communist Party absolutely views America as its enemy and talks about being at war with America. But the U.S. government does not see it that way. Why? There are a lot of complex reasons for that. When announcing the Biden administration's China policy, Secretary of State Antony Blinken went out of his way to say the U.S. doesn't want conflict with the Chinese Communist Party.
We are not looking for conflict or a new Cold War. To the contrary, we're determined to avoid both. We don't seek to block China from its role as a major power, nor to stop China, or any other country for that matter, from growing their economy or advancing the interests of their people.
The problem is, there is already a new Cold War, which China started. The U.S. just doesn't want to admit it. And there is a real divide in U.S. society over it. Just look at the debate over whether or not to ban TikTok in the U.S. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, which means it can be easily controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. If everyone viewed that regime as an enemy, there would be no debate. Many in the U.S. do understand the threat the Chinese Communist Party poses, but there are definitely people who have been outright bought off. But I think a lot of it is ignorance and a faulty worldview. For decades, the Kissinger School basically dominated the U.S. conversation about China. If we just keep doing business with the Communist Party, surely they'll see how awesome liberal democracies are and be just like us. That was an idea actually pushed by Chinese spies. We want reform, but there are a few hardliners in the party who want war. Don't antagonize them by doing something crazy like criticizing the Chinese regime or speaking out against human rights violations. Now, it sounds obvious when I say it like that, but really this strategy duped a lot of people. For more on that, check out this episode of the China Unscripted podcast, China's Spies Are Seducing America. I'll put a link below. China is ruled by a hardline Marxist-Leninist party state. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't hide that fact. It's in China's constitution. And it's a Marxist-Leninist party state that is actively killing Americans. The opioid epidemic is a perfect example of that. But hopefully all of you watching understand the truth and understand we all have a responsibility to share it with others. Thanks for your question and your support, The Crazy Years. And thank you for watching and learning the truth about the Chinese Communist Party. You can support the show for a small monthly contribution over at chinauncensored.locals.com. It's an exclusive censorship-free media platform where you can interact with me, Matt, and Shelley, and other fans of the show. Once again, that's chinauncensored.locals.com. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.